Was Lucrezia Borgia a cold-blooded killer, or just a girl trapped in a family of monsters? They say she smiled as men died, that she poisoned lovers and seduced her own brother. But what if history got her wrong? Before she was a myth, she was a daughter, a bride at 13, a pawn in the hands of popes and warlords. This is not just a story of poison and scandal. It's the story of a woman the world was never meant to understand. Rome, 1480. A city of contradictions. Sacred and profane cathedrals cast shadows over blood-stained streets. The Vatican preaches salvation while whispering betrayal. And into this world of splendor and sin, a child is born. April 18, 1480. Subiaco, Italy. Her name? Lucrezia Borgia. To most, she's just another noble daughter. But to those who understand power, her birth is no coincidence. It's strategy. Her father is Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal with cold ambition. By the time she's 10, he'll rise to become Pope Alexander VI, one of the most scandalous popes in history. Her mother, Vannozza, is not his wife, but his mistress. Lucrezia is born into a web of secrets, power, and sin. Imagine a world where love is currency, where your smile can seal an alliance, and your tears are a nuisance, where lullabies are lies and every cradle holds a future pawn. Lucrezia never chose this life. She was born into it. Italy is fractured. City-states like Florence, Venice, Milan fight for dominance. At the center stands the Vatican, and Rodrigo Borgia wants more than influence. He wants control. Lucrezia becomes part of the plan, a precious pawn. Beautiful, useful, disposable. She grows up with tutors, silks, and scriptures, but it's all preparation for service, not happiness. From the moment she could walk, she learned to curtsy. To read, she studied diplomacy. And when she smiled, men began discussing dowries. Lucrezia wasn't raised by a family. She was trained by a dynasty. While her brother Cesare learned war, Lucrezia learned how to wield softer weapons, her voice, her silence, her charm. At just 12, she becomes a political tool, not hidden, displayed. A girl, offered like a golden key to cities like Naples or Milan. By 13, she's engaged. By 14, she's married. She watched her future traded by men she barely knew. Her body became the seal for treaties. Her feelings never entered the conversation. And yet, they would later call her the villain, poisoner, seductress, sinner. But before the scandals, before the blood, there was just a girl, golden hair, a noble name, no escape. There are no childhood letters, no diary, only contracts, papal decrees, marriage records. Her story was written by others, men with ink and ambition. We don't know what she dreamed of, what frightened her, what made her smile when no one watched. Because nobody cared to ask. She wasn't valued for her heart, only her last name. Before we dive into her marriages, her crimes, her legend, remember this. Lucrezia Borgia was born into sin, but it wasn't hers. She was baptized in political fire, trained as a weapon, used as a symbol. So when you hear her name and think of scandal and seduction, pause and remember the child. The little girl caught in a game she never asked to play. The girl whose blood was cursed not by God, but by ambition. In fairy tales, a young girl's wedding marks the beginning of her story. But for Lucrezia Borgia, it was the beginning of the end of innocence. She was just 13 years old when she was told she would marry. Not asked, told. No flowers, no romance, no gentle proposal. Just signatures, sealed scrolls, and a cold decree from the Vatican. Lucrezia Borgia would wed Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. To the outside world, it looked like a match of power. The Sforza family was noble with military ties and control of valuable territories in northern Italy. But behind the papal curtain, it was a move in a much larger game. Pope Alexander VI, Lucrezia's father, was playing chess with the Italian states, and his daughter? She was the bishop he was willing to sacrifice. 13 years old, forced to smile for men she didn't know, taught to curtsy instead of question, trained to please, obey, and charm. Giovanni Sforza, her groom, was 27, twice her age, more politician than partner, more wary than warm. And though he stood beside her at the altar, he was not her future. He was a temporary alliance, a placeholder, a piece on a board. For 2 years, she played the part. She wrote letters, attended functions, obeyed quietly. But politics move faster than the human heart. Soon, the Borgia alliance with the Sforza family became inconvenient. Rodrigo Borgia wanted stronger connections to Naples, to France, and Giovanni Sforza? He had become irrelevant. There was only one solution: destroy the marriage. The Pope ordered an annulment, not because of cruelty, not because of infidelity. No, they claimed the marriage had never been consummated. Impotence, that was the lie. They told the world that Giovanni Sforza was incapable of being a man, and Lucrezia was a virgin still. It was a humiliation designed not only to sever the marriage, but to publicly shame a nobleman who had once been family. We'll never know what Lucrezia thought in those moments. She had played the role she was given. She had tried to be a wife. And now she was discarded. A child bride unmade, her emotions hidden behind velvet curtains and diplomatic letters. The world saw a marriage annulled, but what it really witnessed was the breaking of a young girl's trust in love, safety, and even family. But there was no time for mourning. Within months, Lucrezia was once again engaged. This time, the stakes were higher, the Borgia name even more infamous, and the bride even more useful. Her second husband would be Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, a prince, a cousin of the King of Naples. This marriage was not just political, it was strategic brilliance. Naples was powerful, and the Pope wanted their loyalty. But something strange happened. Lucrezia fell in love, and it seems, perhaps for once in her life, someone loved her back. Alfonso was young, handsome, kind by all accounts. The two shared laughter, companionship, even tenderness, and soon they were expecting a child. In the bloody world of Borgia diplomacy, it was a moment of peace, a spark of light in the darkness. It's easy to imagine her during those months walking in the gardens, feeling life stir within her, daring, for the first time, to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be happy. But with the Borgias, happiness was always borrowed, and the debt would come due. Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, was no longer satisfied with backroom politics. He had given up his cardinal's robes to become a soldier, a general, a prince, a butcher. And Naples? Naples was no longer useful. Cesare was aligning with France, and the Neapolitan marriage his father had once arranged for Lucrezia had become a liability. So they made a decision. Alfonso must die. The first attempt was brutal. Alfonso was attacked in the street by masked men. Stabbed, bleeding, barely alive, he was carried back to the palace. And Lucrezia? She tended to him, personally, wept beside his bed, prayed, pleaded. She believed perhaps he would survive. But recovery was not what Cesare wanted. One night, a figure crept into Alfonso's chambers. They wrapped a cord around his neck and strangled him, slowly. When Lucrezia arrived, it was too late. Her husband, the father of her child, lay lifeless, his body already cooling, his eyes still open. It was over. Not just the marriage, not just the love, the illusion of safety, the idea of control, the hope of peace. Lucrezia was devastated. Not in the performative way history sometimes assumes of noble women, but truly broken, grief-stricken, shattered. Reports say she fell into deep despair, withdrew from public life, refused food. She was pregnant when Alfonso died. Her body endured, but her heart? That would never fully recover. Something in Lucrezia changed after Alfonso's death. She began to understand the game her family was playing, and that she would always be the piece, never the player. She had been given in marriage like an object, used, annulled, humiliated, then loved, and watched that love be murdered. She was no longer naive, and in that grief, something colder began to form. Not cruelty, but survival. A woman learning the rules of a world that never played fair. Historians later found her writings not scandalous, not hateful, but gentle, poetic, wounded. One line stands out, believed to refer to Alfonso. He was the only one who looked at me, not as a daughter or a bride, but as a person. Lucrezia Borgia had loved, and lost, and learned. The girl who once blushed in a wedding gown had now buried her second husband, and understood, finally, that her life would never be hers. No church would protect her. No man could save her. No love could last long enough to matter. Only one thing remained: her name, and how she would one day be remembered. The world didn't mourn Alfonso of Aragon, and it certainly didn't comfort Lucrezia. Instead, the rumors grew louder. Had she helped kill him? Had she known? Had she cried or had she smiled? And in the silence where truth once lived, myth began to grow. 2 marriages, 2 betrayals, 1 love lost to violence, 1 name dragged through the mud of power. Lucrezia was still barely 20, and already the legend had begun. In the ancient palaces of Rome, truth is a shadow, and rumor wears the crown. And no name drew darker whispers than hers. Lucrezia Borgia. Once a child bride, once a grieving widow, now a legend drenched in poison. Was she truly a murderer, a temptress, a daughter of the devil? Or was she simply the easiest target in a world ruled by men drunk on power? It began as so many lies do, with whispers. Soft at first, but deadly. She sleeps with her brother. She carries a ring that delivers death with a single scratch. She was trained by her father to seduce and kill. These weren't just rumors. They were weapons, and the world aimed them squarely at Lucrezia Borgia's heart. To understand how these rumors took root, we must remember who she belonged to. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, held the keys to heaven and the debts of hell. He was a master manipulator, a dealer in indulgences, land, and human lives. And to the world, nothing he touched could be pure, not even his daughter. Then there was Cesare, brilliant, brutal, raised as a cardinal transformed into a general, the sword of the Borgia family. His bond with Lucrezia was unusual, deep, intimate, fiercely protective. Some said too protective. They dined together, whispered in corners, danced closely at public events, and soon the whispers twisted into accusations. Cesare and Lucrezia, they are more than siblings. But pause. Ask yourself, in a world where women were voiceless and powerful families were enemies, who controlled the narrative? Not Lucrezia. The rumors of incest, with Cesare, even with her father, had no evidence. No letters, no witnesses. Only the words of enemies, the Medici, the Orsini, the Sforza. Rival dynasties who saw the Borgias not as leaders, but as invaders. And in every smear campaign, Lucrezia was the perfect symbol. Beautiful, quiet, powerful by association. To destroy the Borgias, they made her the monster. Then came the rumors of poison. It was said that Lucrezia carried a hollow ring, a small device, laced with a venom so deadly it could kill before the victim even cried out. She would pour the poison discreetly into wine goblets, smile as her enemies drank. The legend became so widespread that to this day the phrase Borgia poison remains part of European folklore. But again, no proof, no murder traced to her hand, no ring ever found. Only bodies and the silence of power. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is how quickly the world wanted to believe. They didn't question. They didn't need evidence. Lucrezia was a woman with power, and that, in Renaissance Italy, was the most dangerous crime of all. And then there were her letters, long forgotten, dusty, fragile, hidden in archives while myths danced across books and plays. These were not the writings of a killer. They were filled with longing, pain, moments of deep kindness. She cared for the sick. She mourned her children. She supported scholars and artists. In one letter, she writes, "I am a Borgia, and that is both my crown and my curse." She knew what the world said about her, what they assumed. But she never defended herself publicly. Perhaps she knew there was no point, that her name had become a story, and stories, once told, do not care for the truth. The real architects of the Borgia Empire were men. It was Cesare who orchestrated assassinations. It was Alexander VI who poisoned alliances. And yet, it was Lucrezia who bore the shame. Every room she entered filled with murmurs. Every glance she exchanged was scrutinized. She was too composed, clearly hiding something. Too graceful, clearly seducing someone. She could not win. If she was quiet, she was secretive. If she spoke, she was manipulative. If she smiled, she was planning a death. Scandal feeds on the silence of women, and Lucrezia's silence was deafening. But maybe that was her only weapon, endurance. Not the ring, not the poison, but the strength to keep living, to walk through fire and never let the world see her burn. In recent decades, a new picture has emerged. Historians have begun peeling away the centuries of propaganda. What they find is not a seductress, but a survivor, a woman raised as a political object who learned to wield influence without bloodshed. She governed Ferrara with fairness. She sponsored artists, poets, theologians. And yet, the myths remain stronger than the facts, because the truth is complicated and scandal is simple. It's easier to remember Lucrezia Borgia as a murderess. It's harder to ask, what did we take from her? What would her life have looked like if her father had been a carpenter, not a pope? If her brother had been a poet, not a killer? If the world had let her choose just once for herself? She once wrote, "I find myself at the center of the world's gaze, but no one sees me." Perhaps that is the most tragic part of all, that Lucrezia Borgia became a symbol, but never a person. And so, the scandal lives on. The incest, the poison, the lies. They are retold in novels, echoed in operas, recreated in television. But the real woman, she is buried beneath the headlines of history, under the layers of myth, propaganda, and performance. Yet, she endures, not as a villain, not as a victim, but as a reminder that in the courts of power, truth is the first thing to die. What do you do when the world refuses to forget who it thinks you are? When every step forward is dragged back by rumors, scandal, and myth? For Lucrezia Borgia, the path to redemption didn't begin with grand declarations. It began with silence, with distance, and with the hope of something she had never truly known. A second chance. In 1502, Lucrezia Borgia was married for the third time. But this union was different. There was no whispered scheme, no bloody motive. This time, it was diplomacy with dignity. A match not for war, but for stability. Her new husband? Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. A warrior, a nobleman, a man who distrusted the Borgia name, but married it anyway. For the House of Este, this was a gamble. They were prestigious, proud, culturally refined. To take in Lucrezia Borgia, the scandal-marked daughter of a corrupt pope, was a risk to their reputation. But politics has always loved dangerous games. Lucrezia entered Ferrara not as the seductress of Rome, but as a woman who had seen death, betrayal, and the cost of survival. She was no longer the naive child bride, no longer the grieving widow. She was something stronger, something quieter. Ferrara was not Rome. It was not ruled by poison or papal decrees. It was a city of art, intellect, and refinement. And for the first time in her life, Lucrezia was allowed to simply breathe. In Ferrara, Lucrezia began to change her story, not through vengeance or rebellion, but through creation. She opened the palace doors to poets, philosophers, and painters. She hosted salons, funded theaters, and supported artists who would go on to shape the Renaissance. Among those she supported was Ludovico Ariosto, the great poet who would pen Orlando Furioso, one of Italy's most celebrated epics. Under her patronage, Ferrara flourished as a cultural jewel, and in turn, the people of Ferrara began to love their duchess. Gone were the poison rings. Gone were the shadows of incest and murder. In their place, laughter, light, letters, music. In Ferrara, Lucrezia was no longer a Borgia. She was simply the Duchess, a woman of elegance, of wisdom, of quiet resilience. But even here, the ghosts followed. Lucrezia bore 8 children. Only 4 would survive. The others were taken. Miscarriages, stillbirth. Behind the grand palace walls, she knew suffering that no title could protect her from. She once wrote, "I have worn every color of joy, but it is black that fits me best." No rumors, no scandal, just a mother, grieving, alone. This was the cost of being Lucrezia Borgia. No matter how far she ran, no matter how beautiful the music or how vivid the paintings she supported, the pain never left. In her writings from Ferrara, a new voice emerges, one not filled with seduction or deceit, but with reflection, with insight. She wrote of politics with precision, of theology with compassion, of art with a depth that surprised even her enemies. In one letter to a scholar, she muses, "It is the quiet things which endure, the painted brush, the whispered thought, not the blade." She became more than a patron. She became a cultural force. The quiet rebirth of Lucrezia Borgia wasn't in grand speeches. It was in poetry readings, in charitable acts, in the way she greeted the people during processions, not with pride, but with grace. And so the city began to forget, not completely, but enough. Enough that mothers named their daughters after her, enough that nobles toasted her at feasts, enough that artists painted her not as a siren, but as a saint of beauty and sorrow. Rome had made her a ghost. Ferrara gave her a soul. She once lived among plots and poison. Now she cultivated gardens and commissioned choirs. This contrast, this transformation, was her rebellion. She would not die the woman the world wanted her to be. She would live, fully, as the woman she had always hidden inside. But not all wounds heal. Not all rumors die. Even in Ferrara, whispers sometimes reached her ears. Old letters would surface. Old enemies would sneer. The past was never far behind. But Lucrezia didn't flinch anymore. She didn't need to. She had built something stronger than fear. Legacy. By her late 30s, she had become known as one of the most respected women in Italy. Not for war, not for seduction, but for her wisdom, her composure, her heart. In the final years of her life, Lucrezia began to withdraw from courtly life, not out of bitterness, but peace. She spent time in prayer, in study, in reflection. She died in 1519, at age 39. The cause? Complications from childbirth, again. History had taken her joy, and now it took her life. There was no trial, no confession, no final scandal, just silence and mourning. She was buried quietly in the convent of Corpus Domini Ferrara. Her tombstone read only her name, her titles, but not her truth. Lucrezia Borgia had been many things: a child of scandal, a bride of strategy, a widow of tragedy, a duchess of dignity. But above all, she was a survivor. She had no army, no throne, no escape, but she endured. She rewrote her story, not with blood, but with books, music, and grace. From poison to poetry, she became her own legend. Every legend must end, but not all legends are laid to rest. Some vanish, faded not by time, but by lies too loud to be silenced. Lucrezia Borgia, duchess, mother, widow, survivor, spent her final years not in scandal, but in silence. And it was in that silence that her body began to break. The city of Ferrara still adored her, but inside the palace, behind the brocaded curtains and marble corridors, Lucrezia was fading. She was 39 years old, but her body had carried the weight of war, loss, and motherhood far beyond its years. She had borne at least 8 children, and with each one, her body weakened. And then, in June of 1519, another pregnancy came. She was already fragile, but she did what she had always done. She endured. The birth was long, complicated. She delivered the child, but her strength was gone. Her organs began to fail. Her body trembled. Her pulse faltered. And as her life slipped between breaths, Lucrezia Borgia, the girl born into poison and politics, prepared to leave the world that had never truly seen her. History does not record her final words, but if we listen closely through the dust of letters, the ache of silence, we can imagine what she might have whispered in that last flickering breath. I have known power, I have known pain, but did anyone ever truly know me? It was not a dramatic end. No dagger, no poison, no arrest. Just fading. A woman who had been used by emperors, bishops, and popes, leaving quietly, the way only those misunderstood by history ever do. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini in Ferrara, a place she had visited often in her later years, a quiet space, far from Rome's poisonous corridors. Her grave was simple, modest, without grandeur, just her name, just peace. But even death could not protect her. Years later, during renovations, her tomb was disturbed, records lost, bones removed. Today, the exact location of her remains is unknown. Even in death, Lucrezia Borgia was denied rest. She is now dust among stone. Her story, scattered across centuries. Not by accident, but by design. Because while her body decayed beneath the earth, her name lived on. Not as a duchess, not as a poetess or mother, but as a myth. They painted her as a siren. They wrote her as a temptress. They branded her with legends of incest, murder, and manipulation. And that's the version that survived. Not the woman, but the warning. Ask yourself, why did history preserve the lies? Why did we remember the scandal but forget the sorrow? Why do we know her brother's crimes but not her poetry? Why did we pass her name from mouth to mouth like a curse? Modern historians have tried to find the woman beneath the rumors, and what they've found is not a murderer, but a woman with sharp intelligence, letters filled with political understanding, empathy, and wit. They found signs of depression, of loss, of longing. A woman caught between duty and desire. One who bore the weight of a family's sins without ever choosing the path herself. Lucrezia Borgia whose name was blackened by men who feared her beauty and never bothered to see her soul. Historian Sarah Bradford. In the end, Lucrezia Borgia died not a villain, but a woman still trying to be understood. There is no grand statue of her, no monument in Rome, just a name in history books, usually next to the word scandal. But if you stand quietly at the convent of Corpus Domini, if you listen to the wind as it passes through the old archways, you might hear something else. Not confession, not accusation, but a question. Did anyone ever truly know me? She deserved more, not because she was perfect, she wasn't, but because she lived. She endured, she loved, she grieved, she gave birth, she buried, she wrote, she ruled, she rebuilt. From the blood-soaked halls of the Vatican to the tranquil gardens of Ferrara, she survived everything. A patriarchal world threw at her, and still left behind music, letters, and legacy. That not the lies is the truth of Lucrezia Borgia. She is not the poison, she is not the crime, she is not the myth. She is the question that history tried to bury, and we must now unearth. The trial has lasted 500 years. The witnesses are long dead. The evidence is buried beneath centuries of fiction, fear, and propaganda. But the verdict still divides the world. Lucrezia Borgia, was she a villain or a victim? To understand her legacy, we must first confront the disease that infected it, propaganda. She was born into one of the most hated dynasties in history, and hatred is a skilled storyteller. The Medici, the Sforza, the French, the Vatican's enemies, they needed the Borgias to be monsters. And so, Lucrezia was cast not as daughter or duchess, but as the family's wicked blade in silk, a seductress, a poisoner, a puppet turned executioner. The stories spread like wildfire. Even centuries later, playwrights and novelists resurrected her, not as a person, but a symbol of corruption. She became the seductive villain in Victor Hugo's drama, the femme fatale in Donizetti's opera, the face of every man's warning. Beware the beautiful woman. But in the shadows of those fictions, a different truth was waiting. Over the last century, scholars, especially feminist historians, have begun peeling away the myth. What they found was not a murderess, but a woman caught in the machinery of power, used by men, silenced by politics, remembered not for what she did, but for what they needed her to be. Lucrezia Borgia was married 3 times, each for strategy, not love. She endured a forced annulment, the murder of a husband by her own brother, and the trauma of losing multiple children. And yet, she governed Ferrara with grace. She became a patron of the Renaissance. She created safe spaces for poets, artists, and women. She wrote letters with depth, emotion, and insight. So, the next time you hear the name Lucrezia Borgia, don't imagine a poisoner in lace. Imagine a woman, educated, grieving, courageous, complex, a woman who was judged by shadows cast by the men around her, but who still managed, for a fleeting moment, to shine.